I'm Karin Christensen. I'm Director of Public Engagement. Welcome to the Newberry. We're very excited about this program tonight. It's part of the programming in connection with an exhibition right now. How many of you have seen the exhibition already? Oh, quite a few of you. Good. I'm so glad. It's called Pictures from an Exposition, Visualizing the 1893 World's Fair. And we have a little brochure about the exhibition and all of the programs in connection with it on the back of the brochure. It's over on the table here, so grab one of those. The exhibition will be open through December 31st, so if you don't have time today, come back and take a look at it for us then. We also have information about a lot of other free public programs that we have scheduled for this fall on the table over there as well. And I always like to remind people that the Newberry is a library. We have books here. You can go upstairs and look at them. We are an independent research library, so that means you don't check books out and take them home, but we have lots of really fantastic rare books, manuscripts, archival materials that anyone who's 14 years old or older can go online, sign up for a free reader card, and then go up to our reading rooms and call up. We have a special quick guide for tonight that was created by one of our reference librarians, Maggie Cusick, who's here in the room. Where are you, Maggie? You can see Maggie? There we go. Yay. It's called Music at the 1893 World's Fair in the Newberry Collection. This building was actually built the same year as the World's Fair, 1893, and so we were collecting 1893 World's Fair materials at the time, and so we have masses of stuff. And so take a look at this. It tells you how to get a reader card, and then it also has information about a lot of materials that are in our collection related specifically to music. Tonight's program is funded by a grant from the Paul M. Angel Family Foundation, so we are very grateful to them for funding this and two other programs that will be held later this fall for the World's Fair programs. Now I'd like to introduce Don Meyer, who is a composer and a musicologist. He's written original scores for several independent films, new film scores for silent films, and incidental music and sound collages for plays, online literary journals, dance troupes, choirs, chamber music ensembles, and TV commercials. As a musicologist also, he has written about music in 20th century radio and film. He's an award-winning teacher, currently a professor of music at Lake Forest College, as many of the musicians tonight are from there. He started researching music related to the 1893 World's Fair in 2016 as part of a Mellon-funded project at Lake Forest called Digital Chicago, Unearthing History and Culture, which resulted in live performances and also a CD called Musical Souvenirs from the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893. For tonight's program, Don has explored music drawn from the Newberry's collection of World's Fair material, including some pieces that were actually performed at the fair, as well as the souvenir music that he had studied earlier. So let me introduce Don.
Thank you, Karin. Thank you all for coming out. This is exciting for us. So, as Karin said, I've been involved with a grant at Lake Forest College to, it's called a Digital Humanities Grant. We've been exploring artifacts from Chicago's history and trying to preserve them. And I have actually done two projects. The first project was a silent film score that was made in Chicago, and then this project. And several of my colleagues have been interested in the Columbian Exposition because there's so much to talk about. There's so much of interest with it. One of my colleagues has done a project about the history of the Pledge of Allegiance, which was introduced at the Columbian Exposition. And there's several other things that we could go on and talk about. So thank you all for coming. I hope this gives you a flavor for what it might have been like in 1893. Both at the fair and also people reminiscing about the fair and bringing mementos home with them. So, of course, the Columbian Exposition was a seminal moment in Chicago's history and in U.S. history. And there's so many important moments that occurred at the fair. And I'm not going to detail all of them, but one one thing that I think about is the advent of electrification, which was just on the cusp in America. And this was also a place where a lot of food items were introduced for the first time. Yes. And the fair had this sort of, one more. Apparently the zipper was introduced. Yeah. And a young writer came to, they called the White City, and was inspired by what he saw there. And 6 years later incorporated an Emerald City into his novel, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. And there's also this interesting argument that Edward Muybridge was a photographer who was in attendance at the fair to give a lecture, and he was interested in sequence photography. And he did this famous sequence of a horse to show that a horse's hooves were at one point off the ground. And so there's an argument that this is the first motion picture exhibition at the World's Fair. So the World's Fair had tons of music at it. There was official programming going on multiple times every day that the fair was open. It was open from May to October of 1893. If you zoom in toward the bottom, in the main part of the fair, there were two halls that were the center places for the music. There was Music Hall at right at a very important location, and also the Choral Hall. And these were massive buildings. They could seat hundreds, thousands of people. And so a lot of the music that was heard at the fair were big, massive concerts. Of course, this is before the advent of amplification. So if you had a lot of people, you had to have massive groups, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So there was official music at the fair, and then there was also music at the national pavilions. All these representatives of different nations were there, and then there was the Midway. But also, I forgot to mention the women's building at the fair, where there was, at the opening of the women's building, there was performance of all women's music, all women composers, which was really surprising for 1893. Theodore Thomas was the director of the music at the fair, and he had just founded the Chicago Symphony Orchestra 2 years earlier. And he had very ambitious dreams for the music at the fair, and he was actually disappointed. People were not attending his concerts in the numbers that he expected, and he actually quit in a huff in August of 1893. Here's a picture of one of the massive concerts in the manufacturing building. You can see the performers are way over there. The manufacturer's building?
How many people there?
I have no idea. What's your guess? Much more popular than Theodore Thomas was John Philip Sousa, who put on regular performances in the bandstands outdoors. And while band music had been around since the Civil War and been popular, there was a new kind of a birth of excitement for concert band music because of John Philip Sousa. But what's particularly interesting is the music that was heard on the Midway, which was, of course, this sort of pleasure avenue coming off the fair. And there was a lot of what we call ballyhoo performers along the Midway. And these are people that would be standing outside a particular country's pavilion and then would be playing music to advertise it. So the result was kind of cacophonous. And a lot of people reported that it was just kind of insane walking down the Midway, all this sound. And a lot of the sound was very unfamiliar to most Americans. So one newspaper reporter said, "It is good for the pilgrim to go to the World's Fair if he have music in his soul and be moved by the concord of sweet sounds. But not that the fair is entirely a bed of roses, for there is a most awful cacophony to be heard upon the Midway Plaisance. There are 2 or 3 authentic and awful bagpipers caterwauling attention to one of the sideshows. Then there are a Turkish orchestra, an Egyptian orchestra, an Algerian orchestra, all of the same model, comprising a giant mandolin and a violin played like a cello, and drums beaten by hand. The Javanese orchestra is more consoling, consisting of mild flutes and an assortment of zithers. All the same, the lover of what the civilized modern man means by music will get little good out of the barbarous bands. So here's another view of the Midway. The Columbian Exposition was also notable for all the souvenirs that were sold, and people were eager to make a lot of money out of this. I guess the first pre-printed postcards were sold at the fair. You could buy spoons, you could buy pipes, medallions, playing cards, and I saw many of these when I was walking through the exposition here, and it's amazing what the Newberry has kept. What's also of interest to me are the souvenirs of music that was written for the fair. And the 1890s was the peak of American parlor music. And so when you talked about popular music in the 19th century, this is what you were referring to. You were referring to the sheet music that people would take home and play. And usually it was women who were expected to play the piano, and people would gather around and sing these songs. Sometimes they were just piano solos, and sometimes they were it had vocal parts. So for this album that we made, we collected a whole bunch of these souvenir pieces, and we performed them and recorded them. Many of them not recorded since ever, actually. There's one piece that was recorded in 1895, but these are sort of premiere recordings that we made, so it's kind of exciting to bring these pieces of music back to life. The composers of the souvenir music are basically unknown people, and in fact, a lot of them were actually publishers, and they were just knocking off these things, and sometimes multiple pieces, and a lot of times they would try to capitalize on some particular event, like Chicago Day at the fair, and they'd write a piece for it. Wouldn't have anything to do with Chicago Day per se, but you could sell some sheet music for it. So one of these is called the Viking March, and this was kind of an interesting moment at the fair. There was a debate at this time. I guess the Norwegians were annoyed that so much attention was being paid to Christopher Columbus when they were sure that Leif Erikson had discovered America. And in the 1880s, a Viking ship had been discovered in Norway, fairly well preserved. So the Norwegians built a replica of the ship and sailed it from Norway to the World's Fair. And it arrived just to prove the point that a Viking ship could, in fact, traverse. And so the Gokstad arrived, and apparently it's still, you can still see this in Geneva. Is that right? Is anybody? I have not been there. So what we're going to hear now, this is Chris White, our fabulous pianist, and he's going to play for us the Viking March. when you start looking at this music, one thing that jumps out at you is how all the titles basically sound the same. So there are any number of Columbian Day, Columbus this, Columbus Waltz, Columbus Polka. So the Columbian Polka, we thought we'd give you an example of. It's interesting because it's written by one of the women composers, written for the fair. And I don't know if you can see, there's a reference to Bertha Palmer at the top, who was Potter Palmer's wife and a major figure behind the fair and also the building of the women's building. So, yeah, let's hear it. the world's Exposition Grand March. Yeah. So one of the tantalizing stories about the World's Fair that has intrigued musicologists for a long time is our awareness that Scott Joplin was here. We don't know exactly what he was doing. There's one report that he was actually playing cornet in a band in a bar off the Midway. But surely he was also playing the piano. And his first important publication was the Maple Leaf Rag, which was 1899. But he was there, and he was hearing this music. And Chris and I were talking one time, and he pointed out that some of these pieces have an almost a proto-ragtime quality to them. So all you have to do is syncopate it a little bit. And it's also well known that people like Joplin how they got their start was taking pre-existing pieces and ragging them, that is, adding the syncopation. So we thought we'd try an experiment. This is the first strain of this march. And then Chris, who's a fabulous jazz pianist, is volunteering to channel Scott Joplin and imagine what he might have done with this. So let's hear the straight version. Now let's hear what Joplin might have done with that. I'd like to invite Kate Carter, our violinist, to come up. So there were these a set of 3 Neapolitan songs that were published, and it was sort of a curiosity why these. And then I read that there were gondolas on the Grand Lagoon, and so I wonder if this was maybe a memory of this experience, right? I'd like to invite Brad Jungwirth to come sing us some songs from the World's Fair. So the streets of Cairo refers to a section of the Midway that apparently when you went in, you really felt like you were in Egypt. And this song is one of the few really big hits from the World's Fair. It was actually, came out a little bit later and was heard in a musical. And it used the famous or infamous Hoochie Coochie song that was apparently written by Saul Bloom, who was a promoter. Do you want to play a little bit of the Hoochie Coochie? Which, of course, is nothing to do with Cairo.
Some friends. That's what I sang when I was a kid.
So this tells the story of a country maid who gets spoiled by the city, ruined by her experiences in the urban wildlife. As you can imagine, there were many songs written about the Ferris wheel, which was quite the novelty and very exciting. And what's interesting about this song is that there's these little piano interludes that I think are meant to illustrate the dizzying effect of being on this thing.
This is the will
No, this is not the same one. This is the song of the Ferris wheel.
But it could be.
So this is more about the perspective that one gets from the top of the fair.
Oh, it's totally like a tour guide for the
Yes.
fair. It's telling you all the great things you can see from the Ferris wheel. So it's like you're there. Close your eyes, it's like you're there.
Let us take a word of
The last vocal number is a comic song about.
Aren't they all?
About a hapless fellow who finds various frustrations on the Midway.
Full disclosure, we did cut the last verse because it had mildly racist undertones. So I think the first four are sufficient enough. Once I walked about the fair, and quite by chance, a big white street that opened there caught my glance. Of all the places that ever came, the joy of life to enhance, I shall never forget its name, Midway Plaisance. I saw a bookie man in half-mast pants, skate very leisurely, skate very Caesarly. I saw a little bird from far off France, grab him as he skated on the plains. Midway Plaisance, Midway Plaisance. I thought I got when they let her fly. Midway Plaisance, Midway Plaisance. I'll get there by and by. Thought I'd kiss the Blarney Stone, the Irish race. Took my money and I was shown into the place. But the keeper, he said to me, your lips aren't take a gibbet's face. If ye want to kiss the stone, you'll place change your face. I saw a notch girl do a notchy dance, quite like a French quadrille, quite only worse herself. But soon I found her out, I had a trance. She came with Columbus to the Plaisance. Midway Plaisance, Midway Plaisance. I thought I'd gone when they let her fly. Midway Plaisance, Midway Plaisance. I'll get there by and by. Next thing that I took in was a beauty show. Soon found out that booking was too all-time slow. Raised my hat to the tattooed girl, for how she pleased me very much. Guard pulled a rope and the sign fell down, please do not touch. I saw a yellow bear run advance, shortish with an old giraffe, give an elephant a laugh. I saw a crocodile with shadow dance, a sphinx who does nothing on the plains. Midway Plaisance, Midway Plaisance. I thought I'd die when they let her fly. Midway Plaisance, Midway Plaisance. I'll get there by and by. Thought I'd ride in the Ferris wheel, my life's insured. But by a lunch bell's joyful peal, I was aboard. I had soup and a chicken neck, and I got out alive. 19 men figured up my check, 10.25. I met a little girl with romance. I grew dear to her, this was clear to her. But when I said I'm broke, the circumstance made her up and leave me on the Plaisance. Midway Plaisance, Midway Plaisance. I thought I'd die when they let her fly. Midway Plaisance.
So now we move on to the part of the program where we're going to hear some music that was actually heard at the fair. And unfortunately, we can't do one of those massed concerts that we saw earlier, but there were a number of smaller chamber music things that were performed. The first piece that we're going to do is the first movement of the first string quartet by Johann Svendsen. Svendsen was a Norwegian composer who lived most of his life in Copenhagen, and not really widely known. This was his first piece actually published entirely, and it was published in 1865. And it's not played that much, and I'm kind of fond of it, so that's why we're doing it tonight. It was performed at the fair on September 20th, 1893. And I forgot to introduce, these are members of the Contras Quartet, so enjoy. So Antonin Dvorak was at the fair, as we know. There was a Czech day in August 12th. It was Bohemian Day at the fair. And during the summer of 1893, Dvorak was working on the American String Quartet and also the New World Symphony. And of course, these were both pieces that showcased his idea for what American music could be if you took advantage of American music that was pre-existing. And there's an argument to be made that this is the beginning of a whole new American school of composition that's going to lead to Aaron Copland and several other peoples to be awakened to what was then called Negro melodies and Native American music. This is the manuscript score, and it says on there, finished 10 June 1893 in Spillville. Thanks God, I'm satisfied, it went quickly. The official premiere of the quartet was in December in New York City, and we're not sure it was actually performed at the fair. There's these tantalizing hints that Theodore Thomas arranged for a private performance, and we thought we'd play you the first movement regardless. So here's the American String Quartet. we decided to end our program with an American. Arthur Foote was a Boston composer, and he wrote this stringed serenade several years before the fair, but it was played at the fair on an all-American orchestral concert on May 23rd, 1893. And it reminds me a little bit of string serenades, sort of backward-looking serenades by Tchaikovsky, Dvorak, and some others. So just wanted to say thank you for coming out and hearing our performance. I hope that's giving you a taste of 1893.